But if we just firstly, just take a pause and sort of reflect on what we've been sort of like hearing today. It really does highlight the space that we're in and the very dynamic space that we are faced with as professionals today in the sort of ESG space, sorry, the EHS space, because in many ways, some could say that we've always been doing what is required. But what is quite clear is that what is starting to emerge is a new set of expectations and criteria. I don't want to call it an entire new paradigm, but I think the paradigm is continuing to evolve. And in that space, what we're now faced with as EHS professionals is this emerging concept of ESG. So some of you may be very familiar with this, but for some of you, this might be relatively new ground. And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to kind of take the next sort of 20 minutes just to chat through the kind of space, and hopefully we can land a conversation in terms of where we are today in general. So just going to pause for a sec. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully you should see the same picture. Let's see if all the technology works. So Zach, just give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen.
Yeah, Mark, that's hundreds.
Excellent. So what I'm going to do now for the next sort of 20 minutes, I'm just going to chat through, I'm going to start with basically a bit of a history lesson of the sort of ESG space and kind of how the EHS space and ESG space and how these spaces are being increasingly kind of moving towards each other. I'm very cognizant of the fact that we all come from quite different perspectives. So let's just call this the world according to Malk. But hopefully it'll give you a good sense of where we're going. And we will make some of these resources available to all of our customers and attendees in the future. So Harry Truman once said, there's nothing new in the world except the history that you do not know. And to some extent, I've been sort of sitting watching this ESG space kind of come to the fore after many, many years of kind of being in the maelstrom of it. And quite intrigued as to kind of how it suddenly gained such a force. There was always an awareness amongst those of us working in the space back in the early 2000s that this would take time to gain momentum. And you never quite know when the tipping point will be reached, but it's quite interesting how the tipping point was reached during the pandemic. And I think in some ways it's actually started to accelerate many of the conversations that we've been having. You know, similarly, what we've seen, and Ecclesiastes captures as well, is that, you know, what has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. And there's really nothing new under the sun. So I guess Truman was very much mimicking what has been said and known for a very long period of time. But there's a lot that's emerging in this ESG conversation, which for many of you might feel like kind of retreaded water. But because of the framing and the context that's coming through, it's quite important to just take a little bit of a step back and appreciate kind of where we're going. So before we dive into kind of like exactly where we're at, I thought we might just start with a little bit of a history lesson in terms of health and safety. And for many of you today, some of you have been in the health and safety and environmental space for many years, and you appreciate kind of how this has continued to change. But it's worth understanding that the history of health and safety goes back a long way, back to early days of the Industrial Revolution in the UK. And really with the introduction back in 1802 by Robert Peel of the kind of Health and Morals of Apprentices Act, which was really to deal with the issue that was being faced at the time of what we would call child labor today. And at the time, they weren't trying to repeal child labor, but they were really trying to introduce better kind of practices and shorter working hours, reducing working hours from 12 to 10, etc. And that really kicked off an increasing amount of awareness in the space, which really saw various legal acts and decisions kind of taking place, which are some of them reflected right in the core of what we have as health and safety professionals today. And between sort of 1800 and really around about 1920, we saw quite a lot of evolution of the space that was taking place. Zach, I just want to check, can everybody see the screen? I just had a notification. So I just want to check.
No, I can still see everything perfect.
Excellent. What we also saw happening was as the world started to globalize and modernize through the early 1900s, we started to see kind of standards becoming increasingly globally ubiquitous, and stuff that was started in, say, the UK and Germany started to spill over into other parts of the world through, I mean, many would say through the colonies to some extent. And although it was probably not universally applied, what we definitely started to see was the improving levels of standards. And in countries like the UK, the US, and South Africa, many of this kind of approaches that we have today have really just been a process of maturing as the health and safety spaces continue to evolve. As much as health and safety has been an evolving space, the environmental space may in some ways be seen to be quite a lot younger in one way, but even older in another. And I love this quote by Zeno going all the way back to 400 BC, where Zeno basically said, you know, the goal of life is living in agreement with nature. And in many ways, I think we've been through an era much over the last 200 years of our attempt to essentially submit nature to the kind of human processes. And I think what we're learning increasingly is that there's a lot more to the way we operate. And, you know, many of the systems and processes we've developed have to become much more in sync with where we're going. Back in 1962, Rachel Carson's wrote the book Silent Spring, and it really was the early kind of clarion call to really get people to think about what was happening from an environmental perspective. And this was very much US-centric in a sense, but it led to a significant shift in the regulatory framework towards clean air and clean water acts that were passed in the US. And that really started spilling over globally into many other parts of the world. The actual timeline is actually interesting to reflect on it in terms of how the broader kind of environmental movements have started to accelerate. And I thought I would put up what is known as the Keeling curve. And the Keeling curve is essentially looking at the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. And in some cases, this is relatively humbling. I updated this as of the beginning of October. And you can sort of see the acceleration of the carbon emissions through kind of probably most of us on this call's kind of lifetime, maybe not all of you. Some of you were born more in the sort of 80s. But if we look at where the sort of very first United Nations conference on environmental matters started, it was back in 1972. And that conference really started to think about human environment and started wanting to kind of explore what we really needed to do to kind of improve the environmental space. Accelerate that over the next sort of like 15 years. And we ultimately had the formation of the Brundtland Commission. And actually, that's where the concept of sustainable development actually started to emerge. In those early days, there wasn't a lot of focus on CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, but many other environmental markers and indicators were at the time very much a sort of a focus area. Other air emissions such as CFCs, etc., and water emissions were increasingly kind of on the table. But there was really a very big growing body of concern around where we were. And this was starting to reflect incrementally into regulatory changes that were starting to take place. We had the Earth Summit in 1992. That really was where the Rio Declaration led to the kind of real acceleration of focus around environmental matters. And in 2000, we saw the development of the Millennial Development Goals. And that was really the precursor to what we know today as the SDGs. For those who are South Africans, they may remember 2002, we had the sort of follow-up conference, sort of 10 years post the Rio Summit. That was the Johannesburg conference with some very important next steps taken. And then ultimately, we saw in between 2012 and 15, the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, or as they are also known as the sort of global goals. And then probably most critically for much of the regulatory work that is happening at the moment, we saw the Paris Climate Accord in 2015, which to some extent was frustrated by changes of government in the US, but we've definitely seen an acceleration starting to take place in terms of awareness. And with COP26 now taking place in the UK and Scotland in particular over the course of the next month or so, we're likely to see a massive acceleration sort of starting to take place in terms of climate awareness, but it's really just a proxy for much of the other regulatory pressures we expect to see through the environmental lens. Now, if we pivot away from the kind of regulatory space, health and safety and environment, the sort of ESG, the EHS lens, it's quite interesting taking a step back just to see where ESG as a concept and sustainability through the investment framework has come from. And much of it for the past sort of 500 years or so has really been driven, or even longer, going back thousands of years in actual fact, has been driven through the kind of religious movements. And we've seen awareness about what you do with your capital and how your capital is used, really kind of starting back with, you know, the early faiths like Judaism and Islam, and really making quite sort of like just like clear decisions about how people want their capital used. It really gained sort of an acceleration through the Quaker movement, who have actually had quite significant impacts in terms of both businesses that are around today, as well as some of the early thinking around kind of real sustainability investments that started to emerge. The Methodist Church kind of started making quite serious decisions about how they wanted their early capital to be deployed. And so that was really the early beginnings of what was really known as socially responsible investment. And socially responsible investment, or SRI, is actually the kind of early driver of ESG. We saw the Greenpeace movement emerging in the 1960s, and then through 1970 onwards, a more secular driven kind of like thinking around environment, which was linked back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and much of what was emerging through the United Nations, with a real awareness of the environmental and social pressures that we were beginning to face as a globalizing community. And then obviously the SDGs have kind of emerged as a kind of a key driver and reflective into much of what is increasingly seen as ESG. And I'll unpack this in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the sort of near-term history, and I'm not going to go through the slide in detail, but I wanted to just tease out a couple of others. This is seen very much through a US lens, but there's some quite key global events here. Importantly, you know, through the nuclear lens, there was the chemicals lens, there was a lot to do with the kind of Chernobyl events at the nuclear and then at the chemical levels that took place in the 80s, and a lot of concern around like how this was started, like even single factories or single places could start having globally or regionally sort of like impactful events. We started to see a lot of government sovereign wealth fund capital, so the Norwegian government pension fund and a lot of the money that was in that space starting to think quite clearly about the way they wanted their investments. They were starting to think through the lens of what we often call as the universal owner, i.e. they've got a lot of exposure to companies globally. They can't really go anywhere else, like a little bit of that planet A versus no planet B sort of argument. More areas of private capital, so sort of rich families and foundations that are really starting to focus the way they wanted to move their capital, increasingly building up the pressure towards the emergence of what I will discuss briefly now as in terms of the SDGs. The PRI principles. And then that has really accelerated over time, kind of really bringing the investment community along on a journey to start thinking about taking socially responsible investment to what we now know as ESG. Now, one of the things that many people don't appreciate is that ESG is really just a rebranding and to some extent a repackaging of the socially responsible investment movement. Now, I'm pretty sure that those out there that know the space well may push back on me a little bit, but I would go so far as arguing that the limitations that SRI was experiencing in terms of impact had a lot to do with this, with the language, and it had a lot to do with this idea of socially responsible investment. Milton Friedman had pushed back kind of quite famously by saying the business of business is business, which in a way like really kind of pushed a certain framing of the way that like businesses needed to think. And so it made socially responsible investment quite hard. And there was a big push to try and box socially responsible investment into a very small moralistic type of bucket. What really happened was this evolution of thinking to say, wait a minute, this is not just about morals, and there's nothing wrong with morals, but this isn't just about that. It's about actually what makes for a good company and what makes for a sustainable company when you're deploying your capital. And so there was this desire to sort of reframe it, and hence the emergence of ESG actually through 2004 to 2006, which really then got popularized and very kind of quite importantly, quite strategically repositioned within the global financial system as an ambitious way of thinking about the way we want to see the world evolve based on the way our capital, many of us are members of pension funds and that, and how do we want to see the money that we are busy saving investing? Because it's great to grow it, but if you grow your capital into a world that is more challenging, more dirty water, less secure, much of the growth that you think you're gaining is really just paying for more and more costs that are being embedded in the system. And so this sort of thinking started to emerge. The principles for responsible investment, which were kind of incubated under the United Nations Financial Initiative, really started to emerge and gain real traction with some of the world's biggest sovereign wealth funds, some of the biggest pension funds starting to sign up to these very clear 6 stated principles. And we saw the CalPERS and CalSTRs, which are the California funds for the teachers and the other sort of government workers. We saw the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. In the UK, we saw the University Superannuation Fund out of South Africa, the Government Employees Fund, all signing up to these principles. And so accelerating a move towards increasing amounts of big capital, recognizing they can't run anywhere in particular. They can't get away from the problem. They need to engage and become, more aware of what their investments are actually doing. And then lastly, we saw the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals under the auspices of the United Nations as well, but very much led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs and his cohort of thinkers out of Columbia University, who were thinking about how we move from a Millennium Development Goal framework to a set of global goals that really start to address key issues that are identifiable by the man in the street or the woman in the street, so that we can actually really identify with what some of these core global goals are and how do companies start kind of aligning their business with actually trying to achieve what are really a collective set of objectives. Now, these goals, importantly, are set out in a way that they're actually first and foremost for governments, but secondly, they become very accessible for companies and for individuals to kind of identify to in terms of seeing where their efforts are leading. So all of this is prefacing the fact that we started to move to a space where there was a growing amount of financial and reputational pressure being borne upon companies. And so this world of the marrying of ESG and EHS started to evolve. As you would have heard in the panel discussion with Therese and Dan earlier, I think EHS has been around quite a long time and has really been at the core of much of the life work of many of the people that are customers of Libryo and many of our partner companies. But it hadn't ever really kind of been shown the real sort of light. It had been very much an operationally focused activity. And what we started to see emerging was that this very operational focused activity, which is so important to the way a company sustains its license to operate, was now starting to become very important through the financial lens, which is like, how do we value a company? And that's where ESG started to come in. And that was very much more top down, where EHS was maybe bottom up driven, on the ground operational. ESG was very much top down, macro driven, principles led in terms of what was important. But ultimately, both were having an impact on the way we think of the firm or the company. Now, one of the biggest investors in the world is a company known as BlackRock, and it's led by a guy called Larry Fink. And Larry, over the course of the last 5 years, has been sending out what he calls his CEO letter. And he's been kind of quite softly in the beginning, signaling to corporate CEOs that the need to start thinking about purpose, the need to start thinking about what your company exists for, other than just simply the purpose of generating profits, became more and more the growing narrative. And in his letter this year, he basically said, that investors are putting more and more global capital into so-called sustainable assets. The increase has been kind of significant. And that, in his view, this would be really the beginning of a very long but rapidly accelerating transition. And quite frankly, one that would reshape asset prices. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, so what does this really mean? And what we're really starting to see is that companies that are kind of conducting what are perceived to be unsustainable practices, or in areas potentially that are not perceived to be industries that need to be around in 15, 20 years' time, are starting to experience some changes in terms of the way the assets are valued. Not always as obvious and logical as you might expect, but it's got a lot to do with the way the financial markets look at investments, which is essentially the value of an asset in its main, and this isn't always well reflected in kind of, let's say, certain spaces, but is really the current discounted value of its future cash flow. So what that really means is the value that you pay for a company today is what you think it's worth to buy a future stream of income that can be generated off that company. And so that's at the core what Larry was actually saying, is that think about how your company is valued, because it's essentially those future cash flows might become more difficult if you're in certain spaces, and the cost of generating those income streams might become more expensive if you are a company that isn't particularly loved by the market, and so your cost of capital might go up in quite a material way. Now, for many of you out there, this will be a little bit kind of like familiar ground, but if we really look at some of the key factors that have always been in the space from an environment perspective or health and safety perspective, many of you are responsible for tracking the regulations, understanding that, deciding on the task that needs to be done, and then identifying the key metrics that need to be measured. And whether it be in the energy space or the water space, you are already quite familiar with many of these things. What's your total energy usage in kilowatts per hour? How many million kiloliters or liters of water are being used in your operation? What are the volumes of your waste discharges in kilograms, or, if it's more of a liquid nature? What are your air emissions like in terms of the various different types of emissions? And from a health and safety perspective, how do you manage health and safety events? What are you doing in terms of training, etc.? So these are all metrics and actions that you've been undertaking. And it's not always totally obvious as to how this maps within the sort of the emerging framework, but I hope that it becomes increasingly clear. ESG is driven to a large extent through a simple set of principles, this historic kind of somewhat siloification, if I can use that word, of environment, social, and governance considerations. But much of what a traditional or an experienced EHS professional is doing every day is actually generating a lot of the information and the day-to-day activities that actually talk into a lot of this. So when an agency like MSCI or Sustainalytics, who do a lot of the investor analysis through ESG lenses, are thinking about a company, they start thinking through these sort of like silos. So for example, they might be looking at climate change and carbon emissions. Well, for an EHS professional, what does that really mean? It's got a lot to do with air emissions. And what does it mean in terms of your CO2 emissions or your carbon intensity of your various operations? Air and water pollution. What are the policies that are in place? But importantly, are you complying with the available regulatory frameworks? And importantly, how are you measuring that? So how can you reflect that in terms of the data? So much of the work that you do on a day-to-day basis as an EHS professional is actually now starting to find increasing relevance within the ESG frameworks that you work. Much the same can be said for a lot of the social components, and I'll unpack that in a little bit more detail shortly. But then there are other areas that don't necessarily form into the traditional EHS space that are becoming relevant, as Therese mentioned, when we start looking at gender diversity, cultural characteristics in a business. But as operating health and safety professionals, you will know that the culture of a business, the way we perceive safety, the kind of steps that we take as management to encourage certain behavior characteristics are critical to good health and safety practices. And so though it may not be strictly reflected in the way the regulatory frameworks are framed, it does actually affect the way that you work on a daily basis. And then lastly, when you look at it through a governance framework, a lot of this has got to do with the way that the work you do and the data you generate and the tasks that are being completed on a daily basis actually get tracked, reported, reflected within your risk management frameworks, but then surfaced up to a board level to ensure that where investments are needed to actually improve health and safety or environmental issues, you get access to capital to do that. Where you need to actually be able to provide data to help the board or the CEO or CFO to reflect out to the market how you're actually behaving as a corporate. Much of that data is actually sitting within the ambit of the traditional EHS professional and their teams. So if we look through the EHS lens, much of this has been driven historically through ethics and social pressure, leading to regulations, going back, think about the 1802 kind of Factory and Works Acts, leading to management practices, trying to figure out your management practices, what were the metrics, and so reporting that. In the EHS space, this has been much more principally driven. So it's been driven by principles, resulting in policies and practices being implemented within organizations. Those policies started looking at what sort of metrics need to map into that, what sort of reporting is required, but only now are we starting to see some of the regulatory frameworks starting to emerge that are going to drive some of the ESG practices. And I think what we'll start to see, much like Therese and Dan identified earlier, is the fact that actually quite a lot of that may be in existence already, and we'll start to see a reframing of some of the regulatory regimes that we currently operate under. So what we're really starting to see is a merger starting to take place between EHS and ESG. And I do wonder if in the course of the next 3 to maybe 5 years, we might see quite an interesting change in the taxonomy or the way we reference EHS and ESG. I suspect that this might sort of start to merge, and that the principles, regulations, management and actions and reporting all start to become part of the same broad kind of category. Now, those of you who are aligned with many of the key spaces will know that there's certain key characteristics of good metrics, and it's a key part of what you do on a daily basis in terms of implementing your various various actions and operations. This is going to be true for the EHS, the ESG space as well, that much of the metrics and much of the action that is required will need to be based on a good set of standardized, consistent, accurately and timely available data. It's going to need to be kind of simple and owned. As you know, it's going to need to be actionable and measurable. And ultimately, it has to be strategic, as it's going to be pushing up into the broader organization. And so much of what you do might go through a slight reframing, but it's ultimately going to be packaged within the same way that you understand it, but with a slightly different nomenclature moving into the ESG space. Now, if you operate under ISO, I think that will become increasingly encouraging. I think a lot of the organizations that we work with are ISO aligned, whether they've done 9,000 or 14,000 or 45,001 alignments across the various spaces. I think we might see the emergence of additional priority ISO areas. 37,000 from a governance perspective. We're already starting to see, the emergence of sort of socially responsible kind of reporting through 27,001 and 26,000 in terms of data. So I think ISO will remain very important from a day-to-day basis in terms of the way you think and operate. Auditing might evolve, but I think it will remain quite aligned to this. And we might start to see ISO standards adopting some of the language coming out of ESG. What's also emerging is that from a finance perspective, we've historically looked at 2 dominant regimes in terms of accounting. It's always been IFRS or GAAP accounting. But emerging across Europe, the sort of Europe, Anglophone world, and then also out of the US has been 2 key kind of requirements. One called the Integrated Reporting Initiative, which is really trying to reframe a lot of the kind of environmental, social data into financial metrics, and SASB out of the US. And what's really emerged quite clearly is the need for these 2 to kind of combine to kind of create a single global standard. And so further supporting the kind of emergence or the development of ESG is essentially the merger of these 2 accounting standards or ESG accounting approaches into what is now going to be known as the Value Reporting Foundation. And that's going to further accelerate what's happening with IFRS and GAAP. And in due course, that will start to influence a lot of the stuff that happens on a day-to-day basis through your organization. So if we take a step back and look at what's really happening out there, I think the traditional world of ISO and the GRI reporting that many of you will be familiar with is going to start merging a lot with the PRI and the Value Reporting Foundation approaches to support the Sustainable Development Goals, but importantly, bring the world that you've historically operated in as EHS professionals together with the world that many of the other people that might be operating or thinking about through a finance lens, which is now the ESG lens, start to merge. And so there'll be a lot more coming together of these 2 spaces over time. So I trust you found this hopeful and maybe gave you a sense of how I see EHS and ESG starting to become increasingly kind of parts of the same world, maybe a top-down macro approach from an ESG perspective applied to the bottom-up kind of operational approach from an EHS perspective. But I can't sort of close out without kind of another quote, and C.S. Lewis has always been a favorite author of mine, and he once said, you can't go back and change the beginning, and I think many of you will know this, given where you are today, but you can start where you are and change the ending. And so, for many people in the space we are today, there can be a lot of challenges and pressure. Change brings stress and pressure at the same time, but I remain optimistic that the work that we're doing as EHS professionals, people focused in the space from an operational perspective, really is at the core of what is actually going to be driving the change of the ending. So I just want to encourage you to be encouraged in terms of the work that you do. Be excited about the opportunity to embrace the emerging paradigm of ESG, and look forward to how this will continue to hopefully improve the relevance of the work that many of you do, but also start to reflect to the outside world in a very powerful and meaningful way.